the mockery of Earth. The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched across a city-sized platform, floating in orbit around a blue giant star. Delegates from 100 star systems filled the seats, their jeweled robes glittering in the artificial light, their voices echoing in arrogance and certainty. At the center of the chamber, the subject of their ridicule was displayed on a vast holomap. It was Earth, a green and blue orb spinning quietly in the darkness. The council members sneered at the little world, calling it primitive, undeveloped, and irrelevant to the coming tides of war. One ambassador from the Kirak Dominion stood tall with his scaled body gleaming, his voice sharp as he proclaimed that Earth's species was barely above savages, that their weapons relied on chemical, combustion and metal projectiles, laughable when compared to plasma rifles and antimatter cannons. Another delegate from the Makari Confederacy chimed in, mocking the fact that humans still burned fossil fuels and used rockets to crawl into orbit. The chamber filled with laughter, deep growls and shrill hisses from the gathered species, a chorus of dismissal directed at a planet none of them considered worth saving or even fearing. Only a few sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the holomap, not with ridicule but with quiet study. Among them was Counselor Raya of the Luthari, a people known for their cautious wisdom. She had read reports from scouts who had observed human behavior, reports that spoke of resilience, of a strange mix of cooperation and aggression that allowed the species to survive disasters that would have wiped out others. She remembered reading of their long wars, their ability to adapt to new weapons in decades rather than centuries, and their unyielding instinct to fight even when cornered. Yet her voice was drowned out in the ocean of contempt. Back on Earth itself, no one knew that the Galactic Council debated their fate. The people of Earth lived their daily lives unaware that beyond the stars they were already judged as unworthy. Soldiers trained in their bases, scientists worked in labs, farmers tilled fields, and children dreamed of reaching the stars. To them, the galaxy was still a mystery, and the idea of alien empires was fantasy. But change was coming. The war, brewing among the stars, was creeping toward their quiet world, and when it came, humanity would not be given the chance to choose whether to join or not. The war would choose for them. Rumors had already begun to spread through smuggler channels and fringe colonies, whispers of an empire on the march. The Korlath swarm, a brutal power that consumed everything in its path, was moving closer to the outer territories. Planets that had once been thriving trade hubs had gone silent. Refugees drifted through space with broken ships and broken hearts, carrying tales of devastation. Still, the Council dismissed the threat, convinced their fleets would halt the invaders. They laughed when Earth's name came up, declaring that if the swarm passed through Sol, humanity would crumble in days. But on Earth, history had prepared its people for survival. They were not the most advanced, but they were stubborn. They had endured plagues, famine, and wars of unimaginable scale. They had rebuilt from ruins more times than the Council could count. To the aliens, they seemed like children playing with sticks. To themselves, they were survivors who had never stopped pushing forward no matter the odds. In hidden bases under mountains, soldiers drilled in old-fashioned warfare, strategies designed for a world of mud, forests, and cities. Their generals knew how to adapt, how to turn weakness into strength. Their engineers studied every scrap of new material they could find, eager to understand and improve. Their leaders fought among themselves, yes, but when threatened by an outside force, they had always found ways to unite. So while the Council mocked, while the galaxy scoffed, Earth remained steady in its ignorance and strength. No one in the chamber of the Council understood what kind of storm would be unleashed once humanity was forced into the galactic stage. No one believed that primitive Earth could matter in a war that spanned the stars. Yet history was about to prove them wrong, because when the first shadows of the galactic war fell upon the little blue world, the so-called primitives would rise in a way that would shake the galaxy to its very core. The first strike, the Korlath swarm, moved like a tide of darkness across the stars, its fleets blotting out suns as they descended upon world after world. Their ships were vast and jagged, alive with bioengineered weapons that tore through shields and armor alike. For centuries they had consumed weaker civilizations, leaving behind husks of planets drained of life. To the Galactic Council, it was expected that the swarm would soon press against their border, but none believed Earth would be anything more than a brief inconvenience along the path of destruction. Earth was not a council world, not part of their alliance, and so it was deemed expendable. When the first Korlath fleet entered the Sol system, there was no warning for humanity. The great ships shimmered into orbit beyond Neptune, their presence blotting out sensors with radiation and interference. For the humans watching their satellites, it was as if death itself had appeared in the darkness. Astronomers scrambled to understand what they were seeing. Governments convened emergency councils and militaries moved into high alert. Yet it was already too late for preparation. The enemy was advancing fast, their formation cutting straight for Earth as if the planet were nothing more than a stepping stone on their endless march. In the skies above Earth, fleets of human ships scrambled to meet them. Compared to the alien armada, they looked like toys, fragile and small. They carried railguns, missiles, and fighters armed with cannons, technology the Galactic Council had mocked as relics of a primitive age. But humans had one thing the invaders did not expect: instinct for war honed through thousands of years of conflict on their own world. They did not cower or wait for diplomacy. They struck first. The first battles were chaos. Human pilots threw themselves against the swarm with reckless courage. Their ships darted in tight formations, weaving and rolling to avoid fire. Missiles streaked out in clouds, railguns fired bursts of hypervelocity slugs, and fighters screamed into swarms of smaller enemy craft. Alien shields that shrugged off plasma found themselves rattled by solid metal slugs smashing into their hulls. Missiles tore into weak points where armor was thin. The swarm had expected easy prey, but instead they found themselves bleeding. Ships in the opening engagements. On the ground, humanity braced for invasion. Cities prepared bunkers, militaries deployed everywhere, and citizens volunteered in droves. Nations that had argued bitterly just months before suddenly found themselves united by survival. Across Earth, people dug trenches, built defenses, and armed themselves with everything from rifles to improvised weapons. To the Korlath, this was madness. No world they had invaded had ever prepared so quickly or resisted with such ferocity. Yet humans were not only defending their homes, they were adapting, learning, and responding to every move with terrifying speed. When the first Korlath landing forces touched down in Eastern Europe, they expected to sweep through with ease. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare of resistance. Human soldiers fought in forests and cities, striking hard and vanishing before counterattacks. Tanks rolled through streets, artillery thundered, and civilians joined the fight with homemade explosives. Every block became a fortress, every valley a kill zone. The swarm's advanced weapons cut down many, but for every human that fell, more rose in anger. Entire towns refused to surrender, forcing the invaders to pay dearly for every meter of ground. News spread quickly, carried by desperate broadcasts and shaky camera footage. The world watched in horror, but also in pride, as humanity refused to bow. Soldiers held positions even when surrounded. Pilots dove their fighters into enemy ships when their ammunition ran out, and civilians carried messages through fire and ruin to keep defenses coordinated. To outside observers in the galaxy, who had begun to monitor the conflict in curiosity, it was unbelievable. The primitives were not only surviving, they were hurting the swarm. The Galactic Council, still laughing in their chamber, at first, dismissed the reports as exaggerations or lucky accidents. But as weeks passed, and as more fleets were tied down in the Sol system than ever anticipated, the laughter began to fade. For every victory the swarm claimed, they suffered losses greater than predicted. Earth was not falling in days or weeks. It was holding, and worse, it was fighting back with a ferocity that unsettled even the most hardened alien generals. Among the humans, fear was constant, but so was determination. They knew the enemy was stronger, faster, and more advanced, but they also knew surrender meant extinction. They had no choice but to resist, and so resistance became their identity. In those early weeks of invasion, when the skies burned and cities shook, humanity forged the beginning of a reputation that would echo across the stars. Primitive they might have been, But primitive did not mean weak. It meant dangerous, and the galaxy was beginning to realize that Earth was not what they thought it was. Primitive weapons. Deadly results. The skies above Earth had become a storm of fire and wreckage as the Korlath swarm pressed harder against human defenses. Their fleets were vast and terrible, but their commanders found themselves frustrated by the unexpected resistance of a world they had dismissed as beneath their notice. Their plasma beams seared across the void, cutting through human vessels, but always the humans returned fire with a precision and stubbornness that unsettled the invaders. For every ship lost, another human crew seemed ready to throw themselves into the battle, not with hesitation, but with a grim acceptance that survival would be earned only through sacrifice. Human militaries had little of what the Council considered advanced. Their ships lacked warp shields, their weapons relied on kinetics and explosives, their fighters still required atmosphere to maneuver at peak performance. Yet in the heat of war, these same weaknesses became advantages. The swarm's shields, designed to absorb energy-based weapons, faltered under the relentless pounding of hypervelocity projectiles. Armor plates that turned away plasma cracked under solid slugs of tungsten moving at impossible speeds. When missiles detonated, they did not simply scorch hulls, they ripped them apart, creating clouds of shrapnel that tore into formations and forced the swarm to scatter. On the ground, the so-called primitive weapons became nightmares for the invaders. Korlath warriors were bred to fight in close formations, their armor resistant to energy pulses but vulnerable to chemical explosives. Human artillery, firing shells that screamed through the air and burst into storms of fire and steel, shattered entire companies of alien soldiers. Snipers with long rifles turned battlefields into hunting grounds, striking from distances the swarm's sensors struggled to track. Even improvised weapons, Molotov cocktails and roadside bombs, devastated armored columns that had never been designed to face such crude but effective tools of destruction. What shocked the observers most was not the technology itself, but the creativity with which humanity used it. A squad of Marines would lure Korlath soldiers into a ruined building, collapse it with explosives, and then ambush the survivors from tunnels beneath. Fighter squadrons dove into the upper atmosphere, forcing enemy craft to follow where their engines faltered in gravity. And there the humans tore them apart with guns that spat streams of burning metal. Naval ships hidden along coastlines opened fire with missiles designed for terrestrial wars. Missiles that locked onto targets with stubborn precision and refused to be jammed by alien interference. The swarm had not faced an enemy like this before. As days turned to weeks, the casualty lists grew unbearable. Entire cities were scarred, millions were lost, but still the humans refused to surrender. Instead of crumbling under the weight of invasion, they adapted. They learned the flight patterns of enemy drones. They intercepted communications and they crafted countermeasures out of scraps of captured technology. Engineers pulled wreckage from battlefields and studied it in secret labs, seeking weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Already, whispers spread among alien spies that human scientists were combining alien alloys with their own weapon designs. The Council could no longer ignore the reports. Delegates gathered in tense silence, watching grainy footage of human soldiers charging through smoke with rifles blazing, of tanks rolling over alien corpses, of missiles punching holes through cruisers. They could not reconcile what they saw with their old view of Earth as a child race. Some began to argue that perhaps the humans should be given aid, that their defiance was remarkable. Others, bitter and prideful, insisted that Earth was a dangerous anomaly, a threat to galactic order if it survived. Still others began to fear, not for Earth but for themselves, for if humanity could do this with so little, what might they achieve with more? For the Korlath, the war was no longer a march of conquest but a quagmire. Their fleets bogged down, their supply lines stretched thin, their commanders baffled by the refusal of Earth to collapse. They had intended to crush a primitive world in days, yet months were slipping away, and with each battle they bled more, heavily. And behind every engagement, behind every desperate counterstrike, the humans grew stronger, fiercer, and more united. The world had never been so scarred, yet never so alive with fury. Families who lost homes gave their last possessions to fuel the war effort. Farmers turned tractors into armored transports. Universities shifted from teaching to designing weapons. Every street corner became a workshop, every neighborhood a fortress. Humanity's so-called primitive ways had become their weapon, and the galaxy was watching in disbelief as the Korlath swarm, devourer of empires, was being resisted by a world that had been mocked as backward. The age of underestimation was ending. Humanity was proving in fire and blood that primitive did not mean powerless. The human spirit. The war had dragged on longer than anyone in the galaxy thought possible. The Korlath swarm had expected a swift conquest, a simple crushing of an insignificant world, yet Earth refused to fall. Cities were shattered, skies were filled with smoke, and the oceans carried the wreckage of sunken ships. But the spirit of humanity had not broken. In fact, it seemed to grow fiercer with every loss. Where one defense line fell, another was built. Where one army was destroyed, another rose from the ashes. Where one hero died, their sacrifice inspired 100 more to take their place. Stories spread quickly across the planet, stories that moved entire nations into action. In the ruined streets of Warsaw, a company of soldiers held their ground for days against wave after wave of alien troops. They fought until their ammunition ran dry, then turned to knives, rocks, and even their bare hands, refusing to retreat until reinforcements arrived. In the deserts of North Africa, local fighters ambushed convoys day after day, their knowledge of the terrain turning sandstorms into weapons of concealment. In the mountains of South America, resistance groups struck at supply depots and vanished into the forests before the enemy could respond. Captured humans became legends of endurance. One soldier, taken alive after his squad was wiped out, refused to give the invaders any information. For weeks he endured pain and hunger, never breaking, never betraying his people. When he finally escaped and returned to his unit, he inspired entire divisions to fight with new determination. Civilians showed the same unyielding spirit. Families who had lost everything still opened their doors to feed soldiers passing through. Children carried water to fighters. Elderly men and women picked up rifles left on battlefields, and entire communities worked together to resist. The Korlath were used to enemies breaking, used to fear spreading faster than resistance. But on Earth, they found something different. The more they pushed, the harder the humans fought back. Their cruelty only seemed to ignite greater rage. Villages burned, yet survivors returned with vengeance in their eyes. Cities fell, yet the rubble itself became weapons as resistance fighters turned ruins into traps. The swarm began to call Earth cursed, for every victory came with losses that weakened their momentum. Beyond Earth, the Galactic Council watched in disbelief. The first reports of human resilience had been dismissed as exaggerations, but now, undeniable evidence flooded in. Recordings of battles showed humans fighting through wounds that would have left other species incapacitated, soldiers lifting comrades to safety under heavy fire, civilians standing against armored war machines. With nothing but determination, council members argued furiously in their chambers. Some saw hope in humanity's defiance, imagining an ally unlike any other. Others saw danger, warning that if humans survived, they would become too powerful, too unpredictable, a new force that could challenge the balance of galactic power. On Earth, the war had unified what centuries of politics and conflict had divided. Nations that once competed now shared resources and intelligence. Soldiers from rival countries fought side by side, their flags flying together in defiance of extinction. Scientists pooled knowledge across borders, building weapons and defenses with breathtaking speed. Even religion and ideology bent to the will of survival, leaders calling for unity and sacrifice for the sake of the species. For the first time in history, humanity stood as one. The swarm commanders were growing desperate. Their forces were bleeding, their campaigns delayed, and their supply chains stretched to the breaking point. They had never faced such relentless defiance, and their pride was wounded by the thought of losing ground to what they had mocked as primitives. Yet for every strategy they deployed, humanity found a way to adapt. The humans did not fight like other species. They fought with unpredictability, with creativity, with a refusal to obey the logic of defeat. To the swarm, this was infuriating. To the galaxy, it was awe-inspiring. In the end, it was not the weapons or the technology that turned the tide in those dark months. It was the spirit of the people. From the highest general to the youngest child, humanity declared that they would not vanish quietly into the night. They would fight, they would endure, and they would rise. And slowly, the galaxy began to understand that this spirit was the true weapon of Earth, a weapon that could not be broken, a weapon that would change the course of the war, turning the tide. The war had scarred Earth beyond recognition, but within the ruins, something new was being born. Human engineers and scientists, once confined to research labs and universities, were now working in underground bunkers and hidden workshops. They studied the wreckage of fallen Korlath machines, pulling apart their weapons and dissecting their technology piece by piece. At first, it was only curiosity, an effort to understand the tools of their enemy, but soon it became transformation. Humanity had always been quick to adapt, and now, under the pressure of extinction, that gift bloomed into brilliance. Soldiers brought back fragments of armor, weapons still glowing with residual energy, even the twisted remains of alien drones. Within weeks, human mechanics had figured out how to power captured rifles with Earth's crude energy cells. Within months, entire teams of scientists were combining alien alloys with human designs. Tanks once fueled by oil and steel were reforged, with lightweight plating taken from Korlath wrecks. Fighter jets were outfitted with scavenged thruster coils, giving them bursts of speed never before possible. Warships in orbit carried hybrid systems, railguns enhanced with alien targeting software, missiles loaded with reconfigured alien guidance chips. The world that had once been mocked as primitive was evolving at a pace that terrified those who watched from afar. The first real demonstration of this transformation came during the Battle of the Atlantic Rift. The Korlath sent a massive fleet to shatter Earth's defenses once and for all, confident that their superior numbers would overwhelm any resistance. Yet when they arrived, they were met not by the same fragile fleets they had destroyed before, but by ships that had been reborn. The flagship Leviathan unleashed a storm of kinetic slugs, wrapped in experimental energy casings, piercing the shields of enemy cruisers as if they were paper. Swarms of drones built from civilian technology and armed with salvaged alien weapons tore into the flanks of the invaders. For the first time, the Korlath did not merely falter, they broke. The fleet retreated in disarray, leaving behind burning wreckage across the ocean skies. The victory ignited Earth like never before. For the first time since the invasion began, hope spread faster than fear. Families emerged from bunkers to cheer. Soldiers, children painted flags on rubble walls. Entire nations erupted in defiance. The idea that humanity could not only resist but win had taken root. It was a dangerous idea, and the Korlath knew it. For a species that believed in its survival was far more dangerous than one simply clinging to life. The Galactic Council could no longer remain silent. Their chambers rang with heated voices, some demanding that Earth be recognized as a legitimate power, others insisting that humanity must be crushed before their defiance spread to other worlds. Delegates studied every scrap of evidence, the footage of hybrid war machines, the reports of impossible victories. Raya of the Luthari reminded the Council of her warnings, that this species had a gift for survival no other possessed, that the spirit of humanity was not to be underestimated. Her words carried more weight now, for the galaxy had seen the truth with its own eyes. On Earth, the unity of nations deepened. Factories worked day and night, producing weapons faster than ever before. Young men and women volunteered in numbers greater than could be trained, each determined to join the defense of their world. Scientists became generals in their own right, their discoveries shaping the strategies of war. Commanders who once led armies for nations now led humanity's armies as a whole, bound together by survival and fueled by vengeance. The Korlath were not blind to the change. Their commanders grew restless, their pride wounded by defeat at the hands of a species they had mocked. They launched more assaults, desperate to regain momentum. But now every strike was met with brutal counterattacks. Human warships began to push beyond Earth's orbit, raiding supply lines, destroying forward bases, even capturing alien vessels intact. Each victory gave humanity more resources to study and more confidence to fight. The swarm had intended to break Earth in days, but now it was Earth that threatened to break the swarm. What unsettled the galaxy most was not just the victories, but the speed of evolution. No species in history had ever advanced so quickly under the pressure of war. What took empires centuries to develop, humans achieved in months. Primitive weapons had become hybrid marvels. Crude armies had become a unified war machine. The galaxy realized with growing unease that the invasion of Earth had not only failed to crush the species, but had awakened it. And so the tide began to turn. Humanity was no longer the hunted prey struggling to survive. They had become predators in their own right, and their eyes were no longer fixed only on defense. They were beginning to think of counterattack. Humanity's counterattack, the day came, when humanity no longer spoke only of survival, but of striking back. For months, the Korlath swarm had pressed their attacks, but their momentum had faltered, their fleets drained, their confidence broken by defeats that should never have happened. The Council had expected Earth to collapse, and instead, it had risen, uniting a species that had never before stood as one. Now the question was not if humanity could endure, but how far it could reach, and the answer came in fire. The first counterattacks began as raids. Small squadrons of human warships, once little more than fragile tin cans, slipped past the front lines and struck at enemy supply convoys. The humans used speed, unpredictability, and sheer audacity. They attacked at night from shadowed orbits. They hid among asteroid fields. They shut down their own engines and drifted silently until the enemy passed close enough to strike. The Korlath, used to facing opponents who fought by predictable rules, could not comprehend the chaos of human tactics. Entire supply lines collapsed as freighters burned, and escorts were overwhelmed. Hungry soldiers on the front lines began to falter, their weapons without charge, their bellies empty. Soon the raids grew into something larger. Human engineers had mastered the art of hybrid machines, and now entire fleets were rebuilt with alien engines and weapons merged into Earth's designs. The flagship Iron Resolve, once a battered carrier, now carried railguns enhanced with alien tracking systems and wings of fighters that could outmaneuver anything the swarm deployed. When the Iron Resolve led its fleet into the battle at Titan Station, the Korlath were stunned. Instead of a desperate defense, the humans advanced with ferocity, cutting through their enemies and leaving wreckage drifting across Saturn's rings. On the ground, the counterattack was just as relentless. Resistance forces that had once hidden in shadows now emerged openly. Human armies no longer fought only in defensive cities, but marched into enemy-occupied zones, liberating them block by block. Armored divisions thundered across Europe and Asia, crushing Korlath outposts, while in the skies drones and fighters hunted alien craft with ruthless precision. Each victory brought new recruits. Each liberation swelled the ranks of those who we believed humanity could win. The galaxy watched with growing awe and dread. Never before had a primitive world risen so fast. Never before had a species once mocked as backward turned into a spearhead of defiance. Delegates who had laughed at Earth now whispered in fear, wondering if the humans were not simply fighting for survival but for dominance. Some even suggested that the Council should offer alliance before it was too late, while others feared that alliance would only give humanity the resources to become unstoppable. Among the Korlath, despair spread. Their commanders argued bitterly. Their soldiers whispered of Earth as a cursed world, a place where death waited for them at every turn. For centuries they had conquered without question, but against humans they faced nightmares they had never trained for. Soldiers who surrendered were astonished to find humans treating them with unexpected mercy, feeding them, healing them, then sending them back with stories that shattered morale. Where cruelty was expected, humanity gave compassion, and that compassion spread fear in ways weapons never could. If such a species could show kindness in the middle of war, what kind of strength would they wield in peace? Humanity pressed harder, pushing into the void. Fleets once limited to orbit now struck deep into enemy territory. Entire Korlath bases vanished in firestorms of hybrid missiles, and colonies once enslaved rose in rebellion, inspired by whispers of Earth's defiance. The galaxy trembled as the impossible became reality. The humans were not only surviving, not only resisting, they were winning. But victory did not come without cost. Millions had died, entire cities lay in ruins, forests burned, oceans poisoned, by battles that raged above them. Every human knew the price of war, and yet they carried the weight with grim determination. They were driven not by conquest, but by survival, not by greed, but by the desperate need to protect their world. And it was this difference, this refusal to fight for empire, that made their counterattack so dangerous. The Korlath fought for domination, but the humans fought for life itself, and there was no greater weapon than a species unwilling to surrender its future. The tide had fully turned. Humanity stood not as prey but as predator, their fleets hunting across the stars, their armies marching forward. The Council could no longer deny it. The galaxy could no longer ignore it. The species once mocked as primitive had become the hammer striking against the swarm. And as the Korlath reeled under the blows, one truth became clear to all who watched from the shadows of space. The final battle was coming, and humanity would be the ones to lead it. Humanity ascendant. The final battle was coming, and the galaxy held its breath as humanity prepared for a confrontation that would decide the fate of countless worlds. Every fleet, every soldier, every mind trained for months in preparation for what many had called impossible, but humans had called inevitable. On Earth, citizens worked tirelessly in shipyards and factories, children and elders alike contributing. In small ways, each effort building toward a greater purpose. The warships gleamed under the sun and moon, their hulls strengthened with layers of alloy and alien technology merged by the genius of human engineers. Pilots trained in simulators that recreated every conceivable scenario, knowing that one mistake could mean annihilation, yet trusting that the human spirit could overcome even the deadliest odds. Across the galaxy, the Korlath amassed their forces, countless ships swarming like locusts across the void, confident that this would be the final extinguishing of humanity. But the humans had grown beyond expectation, their fleets no longer just surviving but striking with precision, moving as one organism, coordinated by artificial intelligence that amplified their instincts and strategic genius. The humans knew that this was more than a battle for survival. It was a declaration to the cosmos that their species would not be underestimated ever again. And so, the fleets met above the shattered remnants of what had once been a Korlath stronghold. A fortress carved from asteroid rock and fortified by centuries of war, its weapons bristling, its defenses unmatched by any force in known space. The humans advanced without hesitation. Fighters streaked past in waves, exploiting every weakness, while capital ships unleashed torrents of energy that carved through shields and armor alike. The Korlath responded with fury, their fleets roaring across space, their weapons cutting through the void in blinding arcs of destruction. But the humans had learned, adapted and evolved with each encounter. They struck not with brute force alone, but with cunning, feints and traps that drew the Korlath into ambushes, turning the enemy's confidence into chaos. Entire squadrons disappeared into fields of mines and automated defenses, the Korlath screaming in disbelief as their numbers fell faster than they could replenish. On the ground, liberated colonies rallied behind the humans, sabotaging enemy infrastructure and attacking with guerrilla precision. The humans were everywhere, fighting on multiple fronts, yet remaining coordinated, their minds bound by purpose and unshakable resolve. As each fortress fell, the Korlath retreated further, their confidence shattering under the relentless human advance. It became clear that no world was safe for them, no shipyard could hide from the relentless human onslaught, and no strategy could match the ingenuity of a species that refused to die quietly. And then the moment came when the flagship of the Korlath Supreme Fleet faced the iron resolve itself. The largest ship in known space, bristling with weapons and shielded by technology no human should have been able to understand, now faced a vessel built by humans who had once been considered primitive. The two ships clashed with a fury that lit up the void, beams of energy tearing through space, explosions rocking nearby ships, the sounds of battle carried through comms channels in a chorus of chaos and determination. The humans fought not for glory or empire, but for survival and the defense of everything they loved. Every shot, every maneuver, every sacrifice carried with it the heartbeat of a species that refused to surrender. In the end, it was not numbers or size that decided the battle, but the human will. Through cunning, endurance, and unity, the iron resolve breached the core of the Supreme Fleet, triggering chain reactions that tore the enemy from within. One by one, the Korloth ships fell into disarray, their forces scattering, their leaders captured or fleeing, their empire crumbling under the unstoppable tide of human resolve. The galaxy watched as the species once mocked for being primitive rose above every expectation, not as victims but as victors, not as prey but as predators, and not as a minor civilization but as a power no one could ignore. The battle ended, but the legend began. Humans were no longer seen as simple creatures of a backward world, but as architects of destiny, beings whose courage, intelligence, and unity had rewritten the rules of the galaxy. Survivors of the Korloth swore never to underestimate humanity again, and even the most skeptical alien empires realized that the balance of power had shifted. Earth and its people had shown that the spark of determination could ignite a fire capable of changing the stars themselves. Humanity had endured, had fought, and had won. The galaxy would never look at them the same way again, and humans themselves understood that this was only the beginning. They were no longer the hunted but the hunters, no longer ignored but feared and respected, no longer primitive but legendary. And in the hearts of every human, the knowledge burned bright that no matter what came next, they would face it together, unbroken, unstoppable, and triumphant. Humanity's dawn. The silence after the war was heavy, but it was not empty. It was filled with the hum of victory and the heartbeat of a species reborn. The remnants of the Korloth scattered across the stars, but their fear remained, and every colony that had once trembled under alien tyranny now stood tall and proud. Humanity moved among the wreckage of battlefields and shattered fleets, with a calm that hid the fury that had carried them through the war. Their eyes were bright with the knowledge that they had survived what no one thought possible, and that they had changed the galaxy forever. On Earth, celebrations erupted, yet even in moments of triumph the humans remained vigilant. They knew the galaxy was vast and full of dangers, but they also knew that nothing could break the unity that had made them legends. The scientists and engineers who had built the ships, the weapons and the strategies that had defeated empires now looked to the stars with dreams larger than any war. They knew humanity would expand not as conquerors, but as explorers, protectors, and innovators, and that every system that welcomed them would witness the strength and ingenuity of a species that had once been called primitive children, ran through the streets of cities rebuilt from the ashes of conflict, laughing and playing, unaware of the full weight of the legacy they had inherited. Yet they carried it in their blood, in their hearts, and in the stories told by veterans who had faced impossible odds and lived. Their courage had become a symbol, and their victories a lesson for every species that thought domination could be achieved by force alone. Humans had learned that strength was not just in power but in determination, in unity, in the refusal to bow to fear or intimidation, and in the ability to rise every time they were pushed down. Across the galaxy, alien races whispered of the humans who had survived the greatest war and emerged stronger and wiser. They told of fleets that moved like one mind of warriors who could anticipate every threat of worlds liberated not by diplomacy, but by the certainty that humanity would not be denied. Their legend grew with each passing day, and even those who had fled in fear watched and understood that they had encountered something extraordinary, something that would change how the universe viewed life forever. Leaders met in council chambers and on bridges of ships to plan a future where humanity would guide peace without oppression, where they would share knowledge but defend fiercely what was theirs. They were cautious but confident, and every step they took was measured by the wisdom earned in the fires of war. They had learned the cost of underestimation and the value of courage, and they knew that these lessons would carry them through whatever came next. The humans were no longer a footnote in galactic history. They were authors of destiny shaping the story of the stars with hands steady and hearts unyielding, and, in the quiet moments as the sun rose over oceans and mountains, and as the stars shone in the endless night, humans reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From being mocked and dismissed to becoming legends and protectors, they had transformed not only themselves but the perception of every being that had looked upon them and thought them weak. They had proven that no matter the odds, no matter the enemies, no matter the darkness, a determined spirit and an unbreakable will could carve a place among the stars. The humans looked forward with hope and pride, knowing that their story was only beginning, that the galaxy would continue to watch and learn, and that they would face the future together, unafraid, unstoppable, and triumphant. The end.